And if you weren't with us last week, we just began an exciting new adventure into the world of Revelation. With all of its prophecies and puzzles, the book of Revelation is easily the most challenging book of the Bible. And as I said last week, it can give you a Charlie horse between the ears. It's also one of the most abused books of the Bible because you've got, prophecy experts, self-proclaimed, ripping Revelation's apocalyptic imagery out of its biblical and historical context and forcing a wooden literalism onto it that does great violence to the original intended meaning of John's vision. Despite all of this, though, the book of Revelation is intended to be a blessing to God's people. In fact, as we saw last week, right in the opening paragraph of Revelation, in Revelation verse 3, the Bible says, God blesses the one who reads the words of this prophecy to the church, and he blesses all who listen to its message and obey what it says. And so for the next several weeks, I want to help you see Revelation as the blessing God intended for it to be. And I want to draw from it some encouragement and confidence concerning the end times. Now, last week I outlined 3 keys to unlocking the meaning of Revelation. First is the setting. Revelation was written to 7 specific historical churches in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. And the more we understand about their setting and what was happening to those churches and in those places at that time, the better we understand the book of Revelation on a whole. The second key is the style. Revelation is written in a unique style known as apocalyptic literature, and it's replete with figurative images and fantasy language. And so the imagery that we see all throughout the book of Revelation is unique to this style of literature. And then the third key is the symbolism, or the symbols, the fantastic beasts and battles and events that unfold all throughout John's vision are symbolic of real people and places and events that relate or were relevant to John's original audience. And if you weren't here last Sunday, I'd encourage you to go ahead and watch that message online. You can get it on YouTube or on Facebook or on our website in a variety of different places. But go back and watch that because it sets the stage, kind of prepares the table for the rest of the book of Revelation. By keeping these 3 keys in mind, as we study Revelation together, we can unlock the meaning of this mysterious book of the Bible. So are you ready to dive in with me? Yep. All right, good. Let's go. If you've got a Bible or an app on your phone, go ahead and open it to Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1. And right from the start, it should not surprise any of us that the star of Revelation is none other than Jesus himself. He steps into the spotlight right in the very first chapter of Revelation, and John lets us know right there that it is all about him. Revelation makes it clear that this book is about Jesus. And in this opening chapter, John introduces us to Jesus in a way that we've probably never seen him before by describing 3 things. First, he describes his advent, then he describes his activity, and finally he describes his appearance. And each of these 3 things is significant both to John's original readers and to us as well. So first, John describes the advent of Jesus, the advent of Jesus. After a brief introduction and comments, hi, I'm John, and I'm writing to these people, and grace and peace to you, etc., Jesus just bursts onto the pages of Revelation, starting in verse 7. It says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. So it is to be. Amen." Now, I'm going to warn you up front, we're going to spend a little extra time on this particular verse, because this verse is the central theme of everything that follows in the book of Revelation. And this passage is often assumed to be a vivid, literal description of Christ's glorious second coming at the end of human history, the culmination of human history, or his second advent, as we often refer to it. However, I believe that when properly understood, this passage has an altogether different meaning. Specifically, this is not a reference to Jesus' final coming at the end of the world. This is a figurative coming at the end of the Jewish age. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, remember that when dealing with apocalyptic visions, things are rarely as they appear. Just as a seven-headed beast represents a succession of kings and a giant prostitute represents a great city, the vision of Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven represents something beyond the surface level, beyond what John actually sees here. And furthermore, John begins the book of Revelation by telling us in Revelation 1, verse 1, this is a revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the events that must soon take place. And then he says in verse 3, he blesses all who listen to its message and obey what it says, for the time is near. Now, these two phrases, soon and near, give us temporal limitations. Jesus and John both expected the prophecies of this book to be fulfilled in the very near future, not 20 centuries or more later on down the road. And finally, the imagery of Jesus coming on clouds finds its origin in the Old Testament book of Daniel. If you remember last week, I mentioned how Revelation has dozens, hundreds of references to the Old Testament. In fact, 500 references in just 400 verses. And this is one of them. Daniel, like Revelation, contains several apocalyptic visions of its own. In Daniel chapter 2, you might remember King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about a statue that has a gold head and a silver chest and bronze belly and iron legs, and then the feet were iron mixed with clay. Well, he explains through God revealing this to him, Daniel explains, that is, to King Nebuchadnezzar, that the four sections of the statue represent four successive kingdoms that would rise and fall: the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and finally the Roman Empire. And he explains that it's during the days of that fourth empire, that fourth kingdom, that God would establish his kingdom on earth. And in the dream, it was symbolized by this giant rock coming and smashing the feet of that empire. And he says that this is God establishing his kingdom. Well, later, Daniel experiences an apocalyptic vision of his own of these same kingdoms, but this time, instead of a statue, they're represented by a series of bizarre beasts, not unlike what we see in Revelation. And when it comes time for God to establish his kingdom on earth during that fourth beast, this is what Daniel sees in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 through 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So Daniel, writing, by the way, around between 5 and 600 BC, so between 5 and 600 years before Jesus was even born, Daniel witnessed Jesus, the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven during the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire. And interestingly, Daniel was told in Daniel chapter 8, verse 26, to seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. So writing 500 years before Jesus was even born, he was told that this is way too far in the future. Don't even bother telling people about this. Just seal it up, because it's not going to happen for a really long time. John, on the other hand, is told in Revelation 22:10 "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll, because the time is near." So for this to be referring to the second advent, the literal second coming of Christ at the end of time, it's been more than 2,000 years since John wrote this. We certainly aren't near John's time anymore if we were far from Daniel's. So what we see here is that this cloud coming of Christ was a far future event for Daniel, but it was a near future event for John. And so if this coming on clouds isn't a reference to the glorious second coming of Christ at the end of time, what is it? And when did it happen, right? I mean, that's what we need to know. Well, thankfully, Jesus actually explains all that for us. In Matthew 24 and in Luke 22, these are parallel passages that tell the same story and have a lot of the same verses in them. Jesus and his disciples are walking through Jerusalem, and several of the disciples start commenting about how beautiful the temple is. They say, "Oh, Jesus, isn't this just a magnificent building? Look at those huge stones and how awesome and impressive this place is." And Jesus says to them in verse 2 of Matthew 24, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And so he's saying that all this stuff you see, it's all going to be demolished. It's all going to get knocked down. And so obviously their next question is, in shock, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place? Luke 21:7. So Jesus then launches into this lengthy prophecy or speech about the fall of Jerusalem. And he warns them that there will be wars and rumors of wars in Matthew 24:6, that the prophecy of Daniel specifically will be fulfilled in Matthew 24:15, that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies in Luke 21:20, and that there would be great distress in the land, many would fall by the sword, and Jerusalem would be trampled by the Gentiles, Luke 21:24. And then Jesus quotes Daniel, saying in 24 verse 30, "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And then, just to make sure everybody understands the time frame, he says in verse 34, just 4 verses after, "Truly I tell you, this generation certainly will not pass away until all these things have happened." So he tells them that everything I've just told you about, the destruction of Jerusalem and the cloud coming of Christ, will happen within this generation's lifetime. Jesus applies Daniel's vision of the Son of Man coming on clouds to the impending destruction and devastation of Jerusalem. And then he makes certain that the audience knew this would happen in their lifetime. This is not distant future. And so for Daniel, this cloud coming of Christ was in the distant future. For Jesus, it was within a generation. For John, it was soon and near. And thus, the imagery of Jesus coming on clouds is not a literal reference to his second coming at the end of time, but a symbolic picture of Jesus coming in judgment to destroy the temple and the city of Jerusalem. The tribes of the earth, back in Revelation 1:7, that he refers to, or the tribes of the land more literally, refers to the 12 tribes of Israel, the Jewish people. Those who pierced him, again, refers to the Jewish people who cried out, crucify him, his blood be on us and on our children." The devastating destruction of Jerusalem and the temple itself was carried out in AD 70 at the order of Nero Caesar. But more importantly, it was Jesus' judgment against the people who pierced him and who persecuted his followers. It brought an end to the Jewish age, the age of temple sacrifices, and to the Jewish persecution of Christians. This advent of Jesus in judgment of Jerusalem is the central theme of Revelation. And that's why it's so important that we understand this properly. Because when we take this verse and we just take it at face value and say, oh, well, Jesus is going to, obviously the heavens are going to be rent in two and the clouds were open and Jesus is going to come riding on these clouds. If we think that that's a reference to the second coming at the end of time, then it shifts the focus of everything in Revelation from near and soon to 2,000 plus years later, which was not the intent of John and Jesus in this passage. So when we understand that right, it focuses all of Revelation on these upcoming events. So the first thing he describes is the advent of Jesus. But there's more. Furthermore, John describes the activity of Jesus, the activity of Christ. After this mind-blowing introduction, Jesus speaks, telling John to write everything that he's about to see in a book. And then John says in verses 12 through 16, "When I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, and he held 7 stars in his right hand." Again, we've got this tricky imagery, right? What's going on here? We don't know. Well, thankfully, Jesus actually explains this one. In verse 20, he tells John, "Here is the secret of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and the 7 gold lampstands. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, and the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches." So the 7 lampstands that he sees in this vision are the 7 actual churches that he's writing to: Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, etc. And these 7 stars represent angels, and a lot of Bibles you might have a footnote in yours that says angels can be translated messenger. Most commentators agree that this is actually a reference to the preacher or the spokesperson who delivers the messages at the churches. And so the important thing here is that the first thing John sees in this apocalyptic, world-shattering vision is an image of comfort and assurance. Jesus is with his churches. He walks among them. He holds them in his hand. And this message is a message that the believers in Smyrna and Pergamum and Philadelphia desperately needed to hear. The city of Smyrna, for example, was enthusiastically Roman. I mean, they were all gung-ho about being Roman. They had a lot of patriotism in that city. And they actually had a temple built in AD 26 dedicated to emperor worship. It was there so that they could worship the emperor. And the Christians in Smyrna experienced intense poverty and persecution because they refused to worship the emperor. Pergamum was likewise a stronghold for emperor worship, but it was also home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the great altar of Zeus. This massive temple featured a 20-foot tall statue of Zeus sitting on his throne. And it's no wonder that Jesus refers to Pergamum in Revelation 2, verse 13, as the city where Satan has his throne. And then in Philadelphia, the Jewish community victimized Christians and used their political influence to try and encourage Roman authorities to persecute them as well. Jesus called them in Revelation chapter 3, verse 9, a synagogue of Satan. And amid all of these different struggles, I mean, all this stuff that's going on, you can see how some of these believers might have felt forsaken or forgotten by Jesus. I'm reminded of this story about 2 boys, pretty young boys, who were discussing the way the sun appears to move across the sky. And one of the little boys says, "Well, my dad says that the sun doesn't really move, that it's actually the earth moving, and it just looks like the sun is moving." That sounded a little crazy to the other little boy. He looked up and he thought about it for a minute, and he said, "I'm going to believe my eyes." And then the first little boy said quietly but confidently, "I'm going to believe my father." If we had been around in John's day in the 1st century and accepted the evidence of our eyes, we might believe that Jesus had forgotten and forsaken us. But thank God the Christians in Smyrna and Pergamum and Philadelphia chose to believe their Father instead of their eyes. And what was true for them is still true for us. I mean, no matter what struggles we face, no matter what trials or tribulations come our way, Jesus is still with his people, his churches. And it doesn't matter if you're struggling through a divorce or debt or depression. If Jesus can be there to comfort his people in the midst of persecution and imprisonment, surely he can help us through whatever difficulties we're going through. He's there for us. He walks among us. He's holding us in his hands. Before ascending to his throne in heaven, Jesus said in Matthew 28, verse 19, "And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." So thus far in Revelation 1, John describes the advent or the coming of Jesus, and then he describes the activity of Jesus, that he's walking amongst his churches. And finally, he describes the appearance of Jesus, the appearance of Jesus. John has just seen Jesus. And of course, this isn't the first time John has seen Jesus. I mean, you and I have only read about the hands that fed thousands, but not John. I mean, John saw them. He had scraped knuckles, rough skin, hairy back. He saw them. He knew what they looked like. And you and I have only read about the feet that found a path through the waves, but not John. He saw them. Dirty, 10-toed, sandaled. You and I have only read about Jesus' eyes, his fiery eyes, his fierce eyes, his weeping eyes. But again, not John. John had seen them. John saw Jesus. He walked with Jesus, lived with Jesus for 3 years. If anyone could tell you what Jesus looked like, it was John. But John had never seen Jesus like this. The image was so vivid, the impression so powerful. He writes in Revelation 1, verse 7, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead." So what did he see? Well, he describes the events like this, beginning in verse 12, which I already read a portion of. He says, "When I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe and a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice thundered like mighty ocean waves. He held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp 2-edged sword came out of his mouth, and his face was like the sun in all its brilliance." Now, if you're puzzled by this passage, you're not alone. I mean, what are we supposed to make of this picture? Do we just assimilate these pictures and piece all these images together and consider it a portrait of Jesus? No. Again, this is an apocalyptic vision of Jesus. So it doesn't tell us what Jesus looks like, but it tells us what he is like. The perfect priest, clad in priestly garments, the long robe and the gold sash. The only pure one, so pure that even his hair is as white as snow. The source of strength with limbs of burnished bronze. The voice of God, commanding as a river and sharper than a sword. The light of the world, his face shining brighter than the sun, beside which everything else pales in comparison. Jesus is all these things and so much more. More than anything, John's apocalyptic vision of Christ reminds us that there is no one like Jesus. In all of history, he stands alone. More songs have been sung to him and artwork created of him and books written about him than anyone that has ever lived. In fact, Jesus looms so large over human history that we actually measure time by him. We date our letters, our birth certificates, and everything else from the year of his birth. Nothing and no one compares to Christ. So this is John's introduction to the book of Revelation, and it's all about Jesus. The advent of Jesus presents the theme of the book, the judgment of Jesus against Jerusalem. The activity of Jesus presents the compassion of Christ, that he knows what's going on in his churches. He cares, and he's with us no matter what. The appearance of Jesus presents the unmatched, unparalleled, unsurpassed majesty of who Jesus is. Now, some people, I think, are uncomfortable with the Jesus that John introduces us to here. A powerful Lord who punishes evil and promises to bring destruction. And they prefer the Jewish carpenter, the pale Galilean, the gentle shepherd. But when evil comes into your life, and when the whole world turns against you and hope flies out the window, you need someone who knows your problems and has the power to actually do something about it. Revelation says that the someone we need is Jesus. So how do we respond to the Jesus John presents here? Well, how did John respond? When I saw him, he writes, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. And I think John's response is the only appropriate response to Jesus. We all need to fall at the feet of Jesus. When we see him for who he is, we fall at his feet in surrender, in awe, and in worship, and in wonder, and as we're overwhelmed by the glory and almost blinded by the brilliance of Jesus. That's the Jesus of Revelation, and he stands above the entire book, and he's the star of the whole thing. Now, next week, when I want to encourage you to join me as we plunge deeper into the book of Revelation. But in the meantime, I want to invite you to just follow John's example. You know, whatever struggles you're going through, whatever trials or tribulation that you face in your life, Jesus knows, and he'll be there to see you through. Just fall at his feet. Surrender to him, accept his lordship. And if you need some help or guidance in figuring out how to do that, just come talk with me after church. You can pull me aside after church or call me at home, or you can come forward now while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.